The luxurious ambience of Amaranth, one of Evelyn Grant's finest establishments, was flawless as always. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light over meticulously set tables, while a soft hum of classical music filled the room. It was the kind of place where even the air seemed expensive. Evelyn sat alone at a corner table, her face barely illuminated under the dim light. Disguised in simple, understated clothing, she blended into the sea of well-dressed patrons. She had done this before, visiting her restaurants incognito to observe firsthand how her staff handled the clientele. Tonight, she wasn't Evelyn Grant, the renowned restaurateur. She was just another customer. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome to Amaranth," a soft, confident voice interrupted her thoughts. Evelyn glanced up and saw Keisha Moore, the waitress assigned to her table. Keisha's smile was polite but genuine, her uniform pressed and spotless. "Can I start you off with our signature cocktail menu? Or would you prefer something from the wine list?" Keisha continued, her voice carrying the warmth of someone accustomed to putting others at ease. Evelyn stared at her for a moment, noting the young woman's poise. Despite the perfection of the service, Evelyn's sharp eye immediately sought flaws. She noticed a loose thread on Keisha's apron and the slightest hint of wear on her shoes. "Of sparkling water," Evelyn replied curtly, not bothering to return the smile. "And make sure it's chilled, not just cold." Keisha nodded. "Of course, ma'am. I'll be right back." As Keisha walked away, Evelyn couldn't help but scrutinize her movements. There was a dignity about her, an air of grace that Evelyn found almost irritating. Minutes later, Keisha returned with a glass of perfectly chilled sparkling water and a neatly folded napkin. "Here you are, ma'am," she said, placing the items with careful precision. "Have you had a chance to look at the menu, or would you like me to recommend some options?" "I know what I want," Evelyn said, her tone clipped. "I'll have the lobster risotto, but make sure the chef doesn't overcook the rice." "I hate mushy risotto." Keisha nodded again, maintaining her composure. "Absolutely. I'll make sure the chef prepares it perfectly." As Keisha left to place the order, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her critical mind already composing an imaginary report. She noted the details she intended to bring up during her meeting tomorrow. The lighting in the corner could be softer, the music was a touch too loud, and, of course, the waitress's slight imperfections. When Keisha returned with the dish, Evelyn inspected it as if it were an art piece under a magnifying glass. She took a bite, paused, and placed her fork down with exaggerated precision. "It's passable," Evelyn said dismissively, "but the presentation is lacking. The plate looks unbalanced." Keisha's expression didn't falter, though a flicker of something, hurt, perhaps, passed through her eyes. "I'll let the chef know your feedback, ma'am. Is there anything else I can do to improve your experience tonight?" Evelyn let out a small, derisive laugh. "Improve? I don't think that's within your power, but no. That will be all." Keisha nodded, her politeness unwavering. "Enjoy your meal, ma'am." The rest of the evening unfolded similarly. Evelyn found fault in nearly everything, from the texture of the dessert to the speed of the service. Though she didn't raise her voice, her sharp words carried the weight of disapproval, chipping away at the atmosphere of professional grace Keisha worked so hard to maintain. When the bill arrived, Evelyn calculated the total with cold precision. She left the exact amount, down to the last cent, and scribbled a note on the receipt before standing to leave. "Perhaps you should reconsider this line of work," the note read. Keisha returned to the table minutes later, only to find the receipt and the absence of any tip. She stared at the note for a moment, her chest tightening. Around her, the restaurant buzzed with the quiet energy of the dinner rush, but for Keisha, the world seemed to narrow to that small piece of paper. "Keisha, table 4 needs water refills," her colleague whispered, snapping her back to reality. Keisha stuffed the note into her pocket and forced a smile. "I'm on it," she replied, her voice steady, though a lump had formed in her throat. Evelyn's return. Later that night, Evelyn sat in her penthouse, sipping a glass of aged whiskey as she reviewed emails. The encounter with Keisha barely crossed her mind. To Evelyn, it was just another necessary assessment of her staff, no different from inspecting a restaurant's kitchen or tasting a new menu item. She felt no remorse for the note she'd left, believing it to be a lesson the waitress needed to hear. Yet, as the hours wore on, something about Keisha's face lingered in Evelyn's thoughts. It wasn't guilt, she told herself, but rather a curiosity about the young woman's quiet resilience. The next day, Evelyn strode into Amaranth, her usual air of authority surrounding her like an invisible shield. Dressed in a sleek designer suit, she commanded attention the moment she entered. Employees straightened their posture, some murmuring nervously to one another. "Morning, everyone," Evelyn said briskly, addressing the staff gathered for the pre-shift meeting. "Let's make this quick. I have a meeting downtown at noon." As the general manager outlined the previous night's performance metrics, Evelyn's eyes wandered to the waitress station. Keisha was there, adjusting her apron and speaking softly to another server. Evelyn's gaze lingered, the faintest pang of recognition tugging at her. "Is there a problem, Miss Grant?" the manager asked, noticing her distraction. "No," Evelyn said quickly. "Actually, I'd like to review the security footage from last night. I want to see how the floor was handled during peak hours." The manager hesitated. "Of course. But is there something specific you're looking for?" Evelyn's tone sharpened. "Just set it up, please." Minutes later, Evelyn watched the footage in the office, her eyes scanning the screen with practiced detachment. Then she saw herself, disguised and sitting in the corner. The camera captured everything, her dismissive gestures, Keisha's polite responses, and the moment she scribbled the note on the receipt. Evelyn's jaw tightened as she watched Keisha pick up the note and slip it into her pocket. The young woman's face betrayed only a flicker of emotion before she returned to her duties. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, an unfamiliar heaviness settling over her. The image of Keisha's composed demeanor replayed in her mind. It was a dignity that Evelyn couldn't quite place, a mix of strength and restraint that made her feel unexpectedly uneasy. She turned off the monitor and stood abruptly, brushing off the lingering discomfort. Yet, as she prepared to leave the office, Evelyn couldn't shake the nagging thought, "Why does she remind me of someone?" Evelyn Grant's day had been a series of tightly packed meetings, sharp decisions, and clipped conversations. By late afternoon, she returned to her penthouse, the skyline of the city stretching beyond her floor-to-ceiling windows. She dropped her handbag on the marble counter, poured herself a glass of wine, and tried to shift her mind away from work. But the image of Keisha Moore wouldn't leave her thoughts. That composed yet vulnerable expression as she read Evelyn's note, it had unsettled Evelyn in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't guilt, Evelyn convinced herself again. Guilt wasn't an emotion she allowed herself to entertain. No, it was something else. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant. "Jessica, I need you to pull the personnel file for Keisha Moore from Amaranth. Email it to me by tonight," Evelyn said curtly. "Understood, Ms. Grant," Jessica replied, though her tone hinted at surprise. By the time Evelyn received the email, it was nearly midnight. She opened the file on her laptop and began scanning. Keisha Moore, 27 years old. High school graduate, some college credits but no degree. Previous jobs in retail and hospitality. Evelyn paused as she read further. Keisha's emergency contact was listed as Clara Moore. The name hit Evelyn like a physical jolt. Clara Moore, her childhood governess. The woman who had practically raised her while her parents were too busy with social galas and business ventures. Evelyn closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, memories flooding her mind. Clara's laughter as she braided Evelyn's hair, her soft humming as she tidied the playroom, her gentle reprimands when Evelyn's temper got the better of her. Could it really be the same Clara? Evelyn whispered aloud. A trip down memory lane. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at her office early, her usual confidence somewhat dampened by her restless night. She barely greeted her staff as she headed straight for her private suite. She pulled open an old drawer, one she hadn't touched in years, and sifted through a pile of photographs. Buried beneath layers of glossy snapshots of charity galas and restaurant launches, she found a faded picture of herself as a child. In the photo, Evelyn was no older than 8, sitting on a bench with Clara Moore beside her. Clara's arm was draped protectively over Evelyn's shoulders, her warm smile a stark contrast to the young girl's solemn expression. Evelyn ran her fingers over the photograph, a wave of emotions threatening to break through her carefully constructed walls. She hadn't thought of Clara in years, and now the woman's name was staring back at her in a personnel file. The coincidence was too much to ignore. Evelyn picked up her phone again. "Jessica, I need the full employee history of Clara Moore. Look through archived records if you have to. Get it to me today." Her assistant's voice was hesitant. "Clara Moore? That might take some time, Ms. Grant. She worked for your family, right?" "Yes," Evelyn snapped. "Just find it. The restaurant floor." Meanwhile, at Amaranth, Keisha was trying her best to focus on her shift. She hadn't told anyone about the note Evelyn had left the previous night, but the weight of it lingered in her chest. She moved through the restaurant with practiced efficiency, her smile in place, her voice steady. But beneath the surface, her mind raced. Keisha had always been aware of the invisible barriers she faced. Being a Black woman in an upscale establishment like Amaranth came with its own set of unspoken challenges. But last night had stung more than usual. As she cleared a table near the bar, her coworker, Jamie, leaned in. "Hey, you okay? You've been quieter than usual today." Keisha hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." Jamie tilted his head, studying her. "Does this have anything to do with the mystery diner from last night? I saw you reading something after they left." Keisha tensed, but forced a smile. "It's nothing. Just another day in paradise." Jamie frowned, but didn't push further. "Well, if you need to talk, you know where to find me." Keisha nodded, grateful for his concern, but unwilling to open up. A sudden visit. Later that day, Keisha was in the middle of taking an order when a hush fell over the restaurant. She glanced toward the entrance and saw Evelyn Grant walking in, her tailored suit and commanding presence immediately drawing attention. Keisha's stomach tightened. She hadn't expected to see Evelyn again so soon, especially not in her true form. Evelyn's eyes scanned the room until they landed on Keisha. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Keisha quickly looked away, returning her focus to the customer in front of her. As Evelyn moved toward the manager's office, the tension in the room grew palpable. Staff exchanged nervous glances, their movements becoming more hurried. Keisha tried to steady her breathing. She knew Evelyn's reputation all too well, a perfectionist with little patience for mistakes. "What does she want now?" Jamie muttered as he passed by Keisha. Keisha shook her head. "No idea. Just keep your head down." Confrontation. An hour later, Keisha was summoned to the manager's office. Her heart raced as she walked down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. When she entered, Evelyn was seated behind the desk, her posture as sharp as her tone. "Ms. Moore," Evelyn began, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Have a seat." Keisha obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wanted to talk to you about your time here at Amaranth," Evelyn said, her voice measured but lacking warmth. "How long have you been with us?" 2 years, Keisha replied, keeping her tone neutral. Evelyn nodded, her gaze unrelenting. "And in those 2 years, have you found the environment satisfactory?" Keisha hesitated. "It's a good job. I work hard, and I try to make every guest's experience memorable." "Is that so?" Evelyn leaned back, her eyes calculating. "Tell me, Ms. Moore, do you feel valued here?" Keisha blinked, caught off guard by the question. I do my best to contribute. I'm not sure if that's the same as feeling valued." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Finally, Evelyn spoke again, her voice softer but still firm. "I believe there's more to you than meets the eye, Ms. Moore. I'd like to get to know you better. Starting tomorrow, you'll be working directly with me on a new project. Report to my office at 9 a.m. Keisha's eyes widened. "A project? What kind of project?" Evelyn stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You'll find out soon enough. That will be all." As Keisha left the office, her mind swirled with questions. Whatever Evelyn Grant had planned, it was bound to be complicated. Keisha's nerves were frayed as she stood outside Evelyn Grant's corporate office the next morning. The sleek glass doors, etched with the logo of Grant Enterprises, seemed to taunt her. She adjusted her modest blazer for the third time, willing herself to stay composed. When she finally stepped inside, Evelyn was seated at her desk, her sharp eyes scanning a document. She didn't look up immediately, leaving Keisha standing awkwardly by the doorway. "Sit," Evelyn said at last, her voice as cold as the air conditioning in the room. Keisha obeyed, lowering herself into the leather chair across from Evelyn's imposing desk. "I've reviewed your file," Evelyn began, folding her hands neatly. "You've been a consistent employee, punctual, professional, attentive to detail. But I wonder, are you truly invested in what you do, or are you just going through the motions?" Keisha blinked, unsure how to respond. "I take pride in my work," she said carefully. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "Pride is one thing. Passion is another. Do you aspire to more, Ms. Moore? Or are you content where you are?" Keisha's throat tightened. She thought of the nights she'd spent studying menus, memorizing wine pairings, and perfecting her customer service. She thought of the rent she could barely afford and the siblings she helped support. "I aspire to stability," Keisha said finally. "To provide for my family and do my job well. Beyond that, I haven't had the luxury of thinking too far ahead." Evelyn tilted her head, as if appraising her answer. "Interesting," she said. "You'll find that most people who succeed don't wait for luxury. They create their own opportunities." Keisha bit back the retort forming in her mind. It wasn't lost on her that Evelyn's definition of creating opportunities likely looked very different from her own. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "I'm assigning you to a new initiative. You'll assist in evaluating our restaurant's employee satisfaction and identifying areas for improvement. Consider it a chance to contribute beyond the floor." Keisha frowned. "I'm not sure I understand." "Why me?" Evelyn's expression didn't soften, but there was a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, in her eyes. "Because you're observant. And because I see potential in you." Keisha wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or suspicious. The first task. Over the next few days, Keisha found herself in unfamiliar territory. Evelyn had her shadowing managers, sitting in on meetings, and even reviewing customer feedback reports. It was an overwhelming shift from her usual routine, but Keisha approached it with the same diligence she brought to every task. Still, Evelyn's presence was unrelenting. The woman seemed to watch her every move, scrutinizing her work with an intensity that Keisha found both motivating and suffocating. "You missed a key point in this report," Evelyn said one afternoon, sliding a document across the table. Keisha picked it up, scanning the highlighted section. "I thought it was redundant to include," she explained. "Your job isn't to decide what's redundant," Evelyn snapped. "It's to present all the information so that decisions can be made with complete clarity." Keisha clenched her jaw. "Understood," she said, her voice even. But later that evening, as she reviewed her notes at home, the frustration bubbled over. "Who does she think she is?" Keisha muttered aloud. "She's impossible to please." Her sister, Alana, looked up from the couch. "Are you talking about your boss?" Keisha sighed. "Yeah." Evelyn Grant herself. "She's intense." Alana smirked. "Isn't she the one who owns the restaurant?" "Big shot millionaire, or whatever." "Billionaire," Keisha corrected dryly. "Well, if she's that rich, she probably doesn't know how to be a decent human being," Alana quipped. Keisha laughed despite herself. "You're not wrong." The unveiling. By the end of the week, Evelyn called Keisha into her office again. This time, she gestured for Keisha to sit without preamble. "I've reviewed your progress," Evelyn began. "You're thorough and perceptive, but you lack initiative. You wait for instructions instead of taking charge." Keisha bristled. "With all due respect, Ms. Grant, I'm still learning the scope of what you expect from me. It's difficult to take initiative when the rules aren't clear." Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Good. That's the first sign of initiative, questioning the rules." Keisha blinked, unsure whether she was being reprimanded or praised. Evelyn stood and walked to the window, her back to Keisha. "You remind me of someone I used to know," she said quietly. Keisha's brow furrowed.
Who?
Evelyn turned to face her, her expression unreadable. Clara Moore. Your mother, I presume. Keisha froze. The room seemed to shrink, her pulse pounding in her ears. How do you know my mother? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn gestured toward a framed photograph on her desk. Keisha leaned forward and saw a young Evelyn, no older than 10, standing beside a woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile. That's Clara, Evelyn said. She was my governess when I was a child. Keisha's breath caught. She had seen that same photograph in her mother's belongings years ago, but she had never known who the little girl was. My mother worked for your families? Keisha asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Yes, Evelyn replied. She was a significant figure in my upbringing. And now, it seems, fate has brought me into contact with her daughter. Keisha's emotions swirled, confusion, anger, curiosity. Why didn't you say anything before? Evelyn's gaze was steady. Because I wasn't sure how to approach it. And because I wasn't ready to face what it meant. Keisha stared at her, trying to process the revelation. The formidable woman before her had once been under the care of the same woman who had raised her. I don't know what you expect from me now, Keisha said finally, her voice firm. But my mother always said respect is earned, not inherited. So if you're looking for gratitude or some kind of connection, don't. Evelyn's expression didn't waver. I'm not looking for gratitude, Ms. Moore. But perhaps there's something we can learn from each other. Keisha rose from her chair, her composure intact despite the turmoil inside her. If that's all, I have work to do. Evelyn nodded, watching as Keisha left the office. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt an emotion she couldn't quite name, an uncomfortable mix of humility and longing. The tension between Keisha and Evelyn lingered like a storm cloud, charging the air with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Though Keisha continued her new duties with professionalism, she couldn't shake the weight of Evelyn's revelation. Her mother, Clara, had been a part of Evelyn's life in ways Keisha had never imagined. For Evelyn, the days that followed were equally unsettling. Memories of Clara resurfaced at odd moments, her warm smile, the way she'd hum while folding laundry, her steadfast presence during Evelyn's lonely childhood. And now, standing before Evelyn in the form of Keisha was the undeniable proof of the years that had passed and the privileges Evelyn had taken for granted. Testing boundaries. One afternoon, Evelyn arranged a meeting in her corporate boardroom, inviting Keisha along with a few department heads. Keisha, dressed sharply in a blazer she'd borrowed from Alana, felt out of place among the suits and power ties. Evelyn began the meeting with her usual authoritative tone. Today, we're discussing our new employee retention initiative. Ms. Moore has been shadowing various roles to provide insight into areas we can improve. Keisha, would you share your observations? Keisha hesitated, aware of the skeptical looks from the department heads. She straightened her posture and cleared her throat. Well, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, I've noticed that while many employees are committed to their roles, there's a significant disconnect between upper management and the staff on the floor. For example, frontline workers rarely feel heard when it comes to operational feedback. That creates frustration and, ultimately, turnover. One of the managers, a middle-aged man with a smug expression, smirked. With all due respect, Ms. Moore, frontline employees don't always have the bigger picture. Their perspective is limited. Keisha held his gaze. With all due respect, Mr. Hensley, they're the ones interacting with customers daily. If their perspective is limited, so is our ability to address real issues. Evelyn's eyes flicked between Keisha and Hensley. She raised a hand to cut through the tension. Ms. Moore has a point, Evelyn said. Our employees' perspectives are valuable. Dismissing them isn't an option. Keisha glanced at Evelyn, surprised by the support. Evelyn didn't return the look but continued the meeting, leaving Keisha to wonder whether her backing was genuine or calculated. The visit. Later that evening, Evelyn found herself unable to focus. She left her office earlier than usual, her driver taking her to a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Evelyn parked in front of a small house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. She hesitated before stepping out, clutching a box she'd found in her storage earlier that day. Inside were trinkets from her childhood, things Clara had given her or left behind when she departed the Grant household. Keisha opened the door, her expression shifting from surprise to guarded curiosity. "Ms. Grant? I hope I'm not intruding," Evelyn said, glancing at the house. "I came to return something."
Keisha frowned.
"Return what?" Evelyn held out the box. "These belong to your mother. I thought you might want them." Keisha hesitated before stepping aside to let Evelyn in. The house was modest but well-kept, with a cozy living room where Keisha's younger siblings played quietly on the floor. Evelyn felt out of place in her designer suit and polished heels, the warmth of the house contrasting starkly with the cold sterility of her penthouse. Keisha took the box and opened it, her fingers brushing against old photographs, a locket, and a handwritten note. Her breath caught as she read the note aloud. "To my dear Evelyn, always believe in your worth." Keisha looked up, her eyes questioning. "She wrote this to you?" Evelyn nodded, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Your mother was a remarkable woman. She saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it." Keisha's jaw tightened. "Like your family's?" Evelyn flinched, but she didn't deny it. "Yes," she admitted. "My parents didn't treat her as they should have. And I didn't appreciate her enough when I had the chance." Keisha's expression remained hard. "You're right. You didn't. And now you expect me to what? Forgive you on her behalf." Evelyn's composure cracked slightly.
"No."
"I don't expect forgiveness. But I do want to make things right. If not for Clara, then for you." Keisha shook her head, her voice trembling with emotion. "You can't fix decades of inequality with apologies and gestures. Do you even understand what my mom went through? What my family still goes through?" Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Keisha cut her off. "You think just because you feel bad now, it changes anything? My mom worked herself to the bone for your family, and what did she get in return? A lifetime of exhaustion, and nothing to show for it." The room fell silent, the weight of Keisha's words hanging heavily between them. Evelyn stood there, stripped of her usual defenses, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said finally. "I know it's not enough, but I am." Keisha didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the box in her lap. A turning point. Evelyn left soon after, her thoughts a storm of guilt and determination. The drive back to her penthouse felt endless, and for the first time in years, she found herself questioning not just her actions, but the very foundation of her success. The next morning, Evelyn called an emergency meeting with her executive team. Her voice was unyielding as she outlined sweeping changes: increased wages for all employees, scholarships for career advancement, and the establishment of a diversity council to address systemic inequities within her company. "This isn't just about PR," Evelyn said, silencing the objections of a board member. "It's about accountability." Keisha heard about the changes during her shift and felt a mix of emotions. She wanted to believe Evelyn's efforts were genuine, but a part of her remained skeptical. Words were easy, actions required consistency. As the days passed, Evelyn's changes began to take shape. Employee surveys were conducted, wages were adjusted, and Keisha found herself at the forefront of discussions about workplace culture. Slowly, her wariness toward Evelyn began to thaw, though trust was still a distant goal. One evening, as they reviewed a proposal together, Evelyn looked up from her notes. "Your mother once told me that strength comes from knowing when to listen," she said. "I'm trying to do that now." Keisha met her gaze, her own expression softening slightly.
"It's a start," she said.
For the first time, Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. Months passed, and the changes Evelyn implemented at Grant Enterprises began to ripple across her organization. Wages were raised, programs for career development were launched, and a culture of respect slowly started taking root. Employees who had once felt invisible now felt heard, and for the first time, Keisha began to believe that Evelyn's efforts were more than just damage control. They were sincere. Despite the progress, their relationship remained complicated. Keisha respected Evelyn's determination but struggled to reconcile her employer's newfound awareness with the harm her family had endured. Evelyn, in turn, recognized the depth of her privilege and the years of damage it had wrought, but she was determined to do more than apologize. An unexpected visit. One evening, Evelyn found herself returning to the modest neighborhood where Keisha lived. This time, she came unannounced, clutching a manila envelope. Keisha answered the door, her surprise quickly morphing into cautious curiosity. "Ms. Grant, I need a moment of your time," Evelyn said. "Please." Keisha hesitated before stepping aside to let her in. The house was just as Evelyn remembered it, warm, lived in, and utterly different from her own sterile penthouse. Evelyn handed Keisha the envelope. "I've been working on something," she began.
For you.
"For your family." Keisha opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of legal documents. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the pages. "What is this?" she asked. Evelyn cleared her throat. "It's a scholarship fund in your mother's name. Fully financed. It's enough to cover tuition, books, and living expenses for you or any of your siblings, now or in the future." Keisha's hands trembled slightly as she held the papers. "A scholarship?" Evelyn nodded. "I know it doesn't erase the past, but I wanted to honor Clara in a way that creates real opportunities. She believed in me when I didn't deserve it, and I want to pay that forward." Keisha stared at the documents, her emotions swirling. Gratitude, suspicion, and an overwhelming sense of loss mingled together. "This is a lot," she said finally. Evelyn met her gaze, her voice soft. "You deserve it." And so did she. Keisha nodded slowly, her guard lowering just slightly. "Thank you. This will mean everything to my siblings." Evelyn exhaled, relief washing over her. "There's one more thing," she added, pulling out a smaller envelope. "I found this in Clara's old belongings. I think it was meant for you." Keisha opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter. As she read the words, tears welled in her eyes. "My dearest Keisha, if you're reading this, it means you've grown into the incredible woman I always knew you'd become. Remember that your worth is not defined by others' opinions, but by the strength and kindness in your heart. You have everything it takes to change the world. Never forget that. With all my love."
Mom.
Keisha's voice broke as she read the letter aloud. "She always believed in me," she whispered.
She did, Evelyn said.
And she was right. A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Keisha began to see Evelyn in a new light. Though the scars of the past remained, Evelyn's actions proved her commitment to change. She didn't just speak about equity and respect, she lived it. At the next company-wide meeting, Evelyn invited Keisha to the stage. Nervous but determined, Keisha spoke about her experiences and the importance of recognizing every employee's humanity. Her words were met with applause, and for the first time, she felt truly seen, not just as a worker, but as a person. As the months turned into years, Keisha continued to rise within the company, eventually taking on a leadership role overseeing employee relations. Her insights shaped policies that made Grant Enterprises a model for inclusivity and fairness in the industry. Evelyn, meanwhile, found herself transformed. Her relationship with Keisha forced her to confront parts of herself she had long ignored. Though she remained a demanding leader, she tempered her sharp edges with empathy and humility. A quiet legacy. One sunny afternoon, Keisha and Evelyn stood together outside a newly built community center. The plaque by the entrance read, "The Clara Moore Center for Opportunity." Keisha ran her fingers over the engraved letters, her heart swelling with pride. "She would have loved this," she said softly. Evelyn smiled, her expression uncharacteristically gentle. "She would have loved you." Keisha turned to Evelyn, the two women sharing a moment of quiet understanding. Their journey hadn't been easy, and it hadn't erased the past, but it had created a bridge between them, one built on respect, growth, and the shared belief that change was possible. As they walked inside together, Evelyn glanced at Keisha and said, "You've taught me more than I ever expected." "And you've shown me that people can change," Keisha replied, "even when it feels impossible." The doors closed behind them, marking not just an ending but a beginning, a story of redemption, resilience, and the power of two women who dared to rewrite their narratives.